All right, take two. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. Today I'm going to dig into a bold experiment in storytelling, sci fi, and sort of a strange corner of cinema, although it's really a short film. Today I'm going to talk about Rakka, the first episode in Neill Blomkamp's Oats Studios project. If you know Blomkamp's work from District 9, Elysium, or Chappie, you already know he's a filmmaker obsessed with world building, body horror, and the politics of power. And with Oats Studios, he got the freedom to throw wild ideas straight into the audience, outside the Hollywood system, or something like that. That's basically the impression that this gives off. So, what is Oats Studios? Between 2017 and 2020, Blomkamp and his team at Oats Studios released a series of experimental shorts on YouTube and Steam. These weren't traditional films, at least in a way they weren't. They were like concept tests, proof of concepts, really, designed to gauge audience interest. Could these worlds grow into bigger features, series, or games? Oates let the audience decide, and it all began with Rakka, released on June 14th, 2017. So, what is the premise and the setting for Rakka? Rakka drops us into a bleak dystopian near future. Earth has been invaded and conquered by a brutal alien race known as the Clume. And when I first saw that spelled out as KLUM, I couldn't help but think of the supermodel Heidi Klum. And I wonder if I'm alone in that. Has anybody else out there watched this and seen that spelled out and thought about the supermodel? I kind of can't stop doing that, like every time I think about the name of the alien race. But anyway, humanity is on the verge of extinction, scattered into resistance cells and barely hanging on. So, yeah, it's one of those sort of stories. The title itself, Rakka, is perhaps layered. It echoes Rakka, that is spelled Raqqa, the Syrian city once under occupation by ISIS, and it's potentially drawing a parallel to resistance under oppression in that way. Of course, this Rakka is spelled Rakka, and I could imagine that the alien language might translate Rakka into shell or husk or something like that, and it could be seen as a reflection of humanity stripped down to survival if that was the case. But maybe I'm just ranting here or rambling, whatever. But I don't quite know what Raka means, and I don't know if they mention what it means in the story. So I watched it twice, and I didn't quite catch the significance of the word Raka, but it is in the title. And if anybody out there has any information on that, feel free to let me know. And the tone and the style of this short film, if you've seen Blomkamp's work, you know what to expect a little bit here: gritty, raw, and heavy atmosphere. But he pushes further with this one. The imagery is a little more violent, grotesque, and relentless. It's definitely a depressing kind of short film. Aliens terraform Earth into a toxic wasteland, turning cities into industrial nightmares. It's a little bit like The Matrix, and you kind of get that sort of vibe from this a little bit, but it's a little bit different as well. And these aliens experiment on human bodies, mutating them, implanting mind control chips, twisting flesh into biotech. It's part war movie, part horror, and part survival thriller. So be on be on the lookout for all of those elements. Well, you don't have to look that far. You don't really need a magnifying glass for it, but you might want to compare it to other films that have those story elements. and see how this one distinguishes itself from other stories that have these apocalyptic themes. It's not a hopeful watch. Rakka is deliberately grim, yet it lingers on one theme: resistance, even when survival looks impossible. And as much as a person might get tired of these sort of stories, it's I I can't help but feel that the sci-fi world comes back to these for a reason, because sometimes you need a story that is about survival. That's something that is a pretty constant theme in fiction. And in this case, the characters and performances, even though they're not fully fleshed out, it's still interesting. This is sort of like a snapshot of this world. Even though it's fictional, I think you get some idea that these characters are somewhat plausible. It's a little bit like The Walking Dead in that some of the characters there and the scenarios, you could sort of imagine them happening, or some variation of them happening even in reality. And the messaging of this movie, I think some of it does transpose into real life scenarios as well, and that's because of these characters who need to resist oppression, and that's pretty much a constant theme throughout fiction. You got front and center, of course, is Sigourney Weaver. She plays a character called Jasper. She's the leader of a resistance cell in Texas. Weaver, of course, carries decades of sci-fi weight from Alien, and I guess Ghostbusters is sort of a sci-fi movie too, supernatural sci-fi or whatever. Um, so her presence grounds the film in that legacy of human defiance against inhuman forces, I suppose, because in both Aliens and Ghostbusters, you have these freaky scenarios of these weird forces uh, coming into the regular human world and wreaking havoc. Well, that's kind of what you have here too. We also meet Amir, a survivor of alien experiments, who gains psychic abilities, and he becomes a possible turning point, maybe even a weapon that humanity can use. It's a small thread of hope surrounded by greater despair, and you have also other supporting roles with Carly Pope and Brandon Aurette. They are frequent Blomkamp collaborators. And this movie isn't subtle. It's a very over the top. Rakka is about occupation and dehumanization. It's about what happens when colonizers strip people of identity, their body, and choice. So there are clear parallels to real world struggles. You've got Rakka already hinting at life under ISIS potentially. Then, I have to say it. This does remind me of Palestinian families under military control, and really any situation where survival is rationed between food, medicine, dignity, and survival. So it might cheapen it to draw parallels with, it might cheapen the real life struggles to draw parallels between those stories and the fictional universe of this story. But I can't help but do it. It's just something that I think of when I think of this movie. And that's one of the interesting things about fiction, is that it really does encourage you to draw parallels between what's happening in the real world and what's happening in this fictional world, and you can perhaps better understand just how dramatic the real life scenarios are, because they are actually comparable to what is happening in these more far-fetched scenarios. That it kind of adds a little bit of perspective, if you will. And Blomkamp doesn't just stop at despair. through Amir's mutation, there's a suggestion that resilience, maybe even evolution, could turn oppression into resistance. And that's like a classic sci fi thing, finding possibility inside catastrophe. You also have that in The War of the Worlds, in a way, the original sci fi film from the 1950s, the way that humanity sort of comes together in order to try to battle the alien menace. So when Rakka dropped, it made some waves. I can't say it was that influential. I don't see that many people talking about it, but audiences praise the visual effects, the world building, and sheer ambition, especially for something free online. Again, this is a short little film, and critics obviously they pointed out flaws. Rakka felt more like a pitch than a complete story. It ends unresolved, leaving us dangling on whether this war continues or if the people truly matter, depicted in the story, including Amir. And even though Sigourney Weaver is sort of the obvious star here, she uh she doesn't really do much, to be honest. I mean, it's such a short little film, and there's so much crammed into it, and it's not like that much really happens with Sigourney's character, but the story that unfolds really, I mean, that's really what's important here. The impression, the way it feels. It's a little bit like Aeon Flux. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but that was a cartoon that I first saw on the MTV series called Liquid Television, and you get sort of a snippet of a story with each episode of Aeon Flux, at least in the Liquid Television version of that story, and in a way that was almost more compelling than if it had been more of a straightforward story. You get these little snippets of like this stylized character, and in Raqqa, you get these. I mean, they're just really little snippets of a grander story. But in a way, that might be all a person needs. You might be able to sort of connect the dots and sort of build your own conclusions about how the story development or developments. Boy, I kind of bungled that word there a little bit. But anyway, it also reminds me about the end of The Matrix, the original Matrix. In a way, that movie didn't really need to expand into a greater franchise because, by the time you see Neo flying in the air like Superman and all that, you kind of get the sense that the the story is going to develop in a certain way. And I suppose the good thing about an open end with even a bleak story like this and with an uncertain trajectory is that you really kind of can draw your own conclusions about where things are headed, and maybe that's the point, the open endedness. Oats Studios wanted to spark demand and not hand over closure. But even if there is no follow up to this, I'm not aware of a follow up to Raqqa. But even if there isn't one, I think this is the type of story where you don't really need closure because the the style of it and the mood and just the craziness of it all is really like story enough. It's sort of like a song or a short story that lets you flex your own mental muscle and sort of build your own universe, I guess. I I think in that sense it worked. People still talk about Rakka sometimes today, all these years later. I guess it's like 8 years later or something like that. And it's one of the boldest sci-fi shorts of its era, you might say. So at its core, Rakka is a mood piece, brutal, sad, but potentially unforgettable. It's less about characters you follow and more about a world you've been trapped inside. As a critic named Dave Kerr once said about the original Alien, instead of characters, the film has bodies. And that quote fits here too. Humanity is reduced to shells, yet shells that refuse to break. And the fact is that the characters are not the main force in this particular story. So whether you see it as a war story, a horror film, or a meditation on colonization, Rakka offers what Oats Studios set out to do: challenge Hollywood formulas and remind us that sci-fi can still be dangerous. So that's it for today's episode of Critical Weight Theory. Well, maybe I'll film it or I'll record another one later on. But for the review portion of today's episodes, that should wrap things up. And if you enjoyed my mixed up little breakdown of Oats Studios Rakka, let me know what other experimental films or series you'd like me to cover. Maybe I'll add those to my list. And thanks for listening, and remember, resistance never dies easy.